The grand ballroom glittered with golden chandeliers, the kind that dripped light across polished marble floors. Soft music played in the background while elegantly dressed guests sipped champagne and whispered about the arrival of the mysterious billionaire. Cameras flashed near the entrance as journalists jostled for position, hoping to capture a headline-worthy moment. Suddenly, the tall figure appeared, his presence commanding the entire hall. He was sharply dressed in a tailored suit, every detail perfectly aligned, his face stern but dignified. The murmurs grew louder. This was the German billionaire everyone had been waiting for. People stepped aside to make room as he entered, all eyes following his every move. He gave a polite nod, then raised his hand in greeting before speaking. His deep, authoritative voice filled the room, but the words were foreign, sharp and rhythmic, spoken in flawless German. The crowd froze, smiles faltered, and whispers began to ripple through the audience. A few tried to laugh it off, others leaned closer to one another, confused. Reporters held out their microphones, waiting for something they could understand, but none came. The billionaire continued speaking confidently, expecting applause, expecting recognition, but instead, he was met with blank stares and awkward silence. A flicker of frustration passed across his face. His gestures grew more animated as he tried to explain himself, his words rolling faster, but the barrier between him and the crowd only grew thicker. The grand introduction that was meant to impress had turned into a wall of misunderstanding. Somewhere in the back, servants carrying trays paused to watch. The air that had once been buzzing with excitement now carried a weight of unease. Musicians themselves felt the awkward tension hanging in the air. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their once bright expressions fading into uneasy glances. A group of investors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads as if dismissing the man entirely. One journalist attempted to salvage the moment, calling out in broken English, but the billionaire responded firmly in German, his tone impatient, his eyes narrowing at the lack of understanding. Laughter broke out in small corners of the room, polite at first, then sharper, mocking. To many, his inability, or refusal, to speak their language seemed like arrogance. A woman in a glittering gown leaned toward her companion and whispered that he must be looking down on them, unwilling to lower himself to their level. Across the room, others speculated, inventing stories about his pride, his coldness, his so-called superiority. The man who had come to impress was now being judged harshly, his image twisting into that of an outsider. The billionaire's jaw tightened, his proud demeanor slipping into visible frustration. His hands moved more urgently as he tried to communicate, but without understanding, his every word dissolved into meaningless sound. The audience grew restless, some even turning away, ready to write him off as a failure. He stood alone, surrounded by hundreds, yet more isolated than he had ever felt in his empire of wealth. And then, quietly, from the farthest edge of the room, someone was watching. A woman in a plain uniform, carrying an empty tray, her presence nearly invisible against the lavish background. She had seen the whole ordeal, the arrogance the guests believed, the despair hidden in the billionaire's eyes. Unlike the rest, she understood every word that had fallen into silence. She knew his story, his intent, and his struggle. But she hesitated, torn between her place as a servant and the pull in her heart to step forward. The room had grown heavier with every passing second, the murmurs swelling into quiet. Ridicule. The billionaire's voice, still strong but increasingly strained, echoed against the marble walls, landing on deaf ears. He paused for a moment, scanning the crowd, his sharp eyes searching desperately for the faintest spark of understanding, but all he found were blank stares and condescending smiles. His hands, once confidently folded, now fidgeted against his cufflinks. For the first time in years, he looked out of control. Then, a sound broke the silence, not laughter, not chatter, but a voice. Clear, soft, and in German. The crowd turned sharply toward the back of the room. Standing there, almost hidden among the servers, was the housekeeper. She clutched her tray to her chest, trembling slightly, but her eyes held steady courage. Her words, though modestly spoken, carried fluency and warmth. The billionaire froze mid-sentence, stunned. His eyes widened, as if he had discovered an oasis in the desert. For the first time all evening, he felt heard. She stepped closer, her voice growing firmer as she repeated his message in English for the guests. How he had come not to boast of wealth, but to share opportunities, his plans to invest in jobs, education, and communities. The audience, once skeptical, now leaned in, drawn by the sincerity in her tone. The harsh judgments in their eyes softened, replaced by curiosity. The billionaire's entire demeanor shifted. The tension in his jaw eased, his shoulders relaxed, and slowly, he smiled, a rare, genuine expression of relief. He looked at the housekeeper not as a servant, but as the only person who had given him back his voice. The applause began hesitantly, a few polite claps at first, but soon the hall thundered with admiration. Guests who had dismissed the billionaire minutes earlier were now leaning forward eagerly, nodding, whispering in awe. The housekeeper's steady translations painted him in a completely new light, no longer an aloof foreigner, but a visionary who wanted to build bridges between nations, to bring prosperity where it was most needed. Every sentence she spoke carried his passion, and the crowd felt it. The billionaire stood taller now, his confidence restored, but his eyes never left the housekeeper. When she finished his final words, about unity, respect, and the power of opportunity, the room erupted in a standing ovation. He didn't bask in their applause. Instead, he turned toward her, his expression softened with gratitude that words alone could not carry. Slowly, he approached. The crowd parted, astonished to see the most powerful man in the room walking toward a woman in a plain uniform. He extended his hand, and with a respectful bow of his head, he thanked her, in German first, then with her help, in English. Without you, I would have been unheard. Tonight, you are the reason they understand me. Gasps rippled through the audience as he went further. Publicly, before everyone, he announced she would no longer serve as a housekeeper. From that moment on, she would stand by his side as his personal assistant, his voice when the world could not hear him. The hall fell silent again, but this time in awe, before breaking into roaring applause. Tears welled in her eyes, disbelief written across her face. Just hours ago, she was invisible in the corners of the room, now she stood at the center, her worth finally seen. And as the billionaire offered her a place in his future, she realized that sometimes the smallest voices are the ones destined to change the loudest rooms.